Hello.
Hi, Sarah.
How's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. Good.
Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Do you feel all set on your end, or do you want to get your screen up before 4 o'clock hits?
Yeah, it'd be great if I can share my screen. I'm just going to go ahead. There we go. Oh, that's the slide I'm looking at right now, but I'll put it in presenting mode. There you go.
A few people who have joined us so far. So to those of you who are on early, welcome. And as we get set up behind the scenes, just hang in there and we'll start promptly at 4.
Hello.
Hi, Jacob.
Hi, how is everyone this evening?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I don't know about the rest of the peninsula, but the island, the sun just opened up like 20 minutes ago. It's just stupendous.
That's wonderful. It's a little cloudy here, but it's still beautiful.
I imagine it won't last based on the forecast I saw for the evening, but it's certainly nice for the time being.
Yeah.
Hi, Sarah. It's nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you too.
Sarah, where are you connecting from?
I'm in Cutler.
Nice.
Yep. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, it's also pretty cloudy here and supposed to rain tonight. So, it's how it goes in the spring.
Absolutely.
Totally. Did anyone hear that there might be snow this weekend? Is that a rumor or is that true?
Yeah, I also heard that.
Oh dear. I hope the few things I planted in my garden survive if it snows.
I have that same worry, but what will be, I guess.
Exactly.
It's too late now.
Yep. Cool. So I can see on my end that we have 21 people who have showed up.
Great.
Awesome. Couple more minutes till 4.
Okay.
Sarah, we thought we would do a introduction and kind of a little bit of like webinar etiquette, and then we would pass it on to you.
Awesome.
And do you mind telling me how to pronounce your last name?
Oh, absolutely. It's Madronal.
Madronal. Okay, awesome. I was practicing it and was trying it all sorts of ways, but I wasn't sure which was going to be correct.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for asking. And I think once I get started, I'm actually going to shut my video off until we do questions, just in case there's any internet issues. It'll broadcast a little bit easier.
Perfect. That sounds good. Okay. All right, well, it says 4 p.m. on my end. Shall we get started?
Absolutely.
All right. So thank you all for joining us for the second webinar in our series, Friends from the Field. My name is Lander Nesbitt, and I work for Blue Hill Heritage Trust as the Outreach Coordinator. And this is a program that is co-hosted by Blue Hill Heritage Trust, a community conservation organization for the Blue Hill Peninsula, and as well as the Island Heritage Trust, which is a land trust for Deer Isle, Stonington, and the surrounding islands. And I'm so excited to introduce to you Jake from Island Heritage Trust.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I confidently speak for everyone from IH2 when I say we're so excited about this collaboration and the diverse content that we're bringing to our followers in the greater area. So we have a couple of prompt questions that feel free to drop your answers or further questions in the chat box at any point. I'm going to share those with you in just a moment. And then also we are not going to be using the raise your hand feature. I don't know if that's available there, but we're just going to save our questions for Sarah until the end. And we'll save like 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the presentation. So we'll move right along, and I'm going to share those prompt questions. You guys feel free to answer them or ask any other questions that you have throughout the presentation. And I'll hand it back over to Lander. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. So I think without further ado, I would like to introduce Sarah Madronal. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Perfect.
Awesome. She's a fisheries biologist and the regional organizer for Downeast Salmon Federation, and she's going to be our presenter tonight. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yes, of course. So as I said a little bit before, I'm just going to shut my video off and we can jump into it just for internet purposes. All right. So I'm hoping tonight that we can all go over a brief overview of what smelt are, what sea-run smelt are, why they should be important to all of us, and maybe how we can all participate in their restoration. So I'm hoping that we have a lot of questions at the end so we can have further discussion. I'm really looking forward to that. But as Lander said, I work for Downeast Salmon Federation, and I'm also under contract with the Nature Conservancy and Alewife Harvesters of Maine. So smelt is one part of my job, but a lot of my job is monitoring sea-run fish like smelt. So to just jump right into it, these are all the Diadromous fish of Maine, and Diadromous just means sea run. So all of these fish, I'm sure a lot of you know or recognize a lot of these different fish, spend part of their lives in the ocean and part of their lives in fresh water. So you can see that red box is rainbow smelt. That's the species we're talking about today. We're specifically just talking about sea-run rainbow smelt. I know that there are, and I'm sure some of you know, that there are landlocked rainbow smelt as well. It's the same species, just different life histories. So today we're just going to be talking about sea-run fish. And I always have to mention when I show this slide that the more of these sea-run fish and potentially fisheries that we have in our waters in Maine, the healthier that our fish and our estuaries and our oceans and river environments can be. So certainly today we're just talking about smelt, but all of these species are so important. So now I just want to jump into the basics about smelt so we can all really, when I say smelt, you know what I'm talking about. So you can see those two pictures. They're a long, slender fish. They've kind of got an olivey green to bluish top to them, and then that really bright silvery side. And they've got a very pointed head. They've got that forked tail. And if you ever see one in a stream and you're like, hey, I'm not sure what that is, the only other species that's similar is the silver side, and they don't have the same life cycle as smelt. So if you're looking for these kinds of fish this time of year, it's not too hard to tell them apart. So in terms of their basic biology and life cycle this time of year, so March to May, depending on where you are in Maine. So it would certainly be March in southern Maine to May, in the Cobscook Bay area. The smelt are going to start swimming upstream and spawning. So that's adults that are 1, 2, or 3 years old. Smelt live up to 6 years old, and they're going to swim upstream from the estuary up into fresh water. Smelt typically don't go more than a couple hundred yards above the head of tide. So that's the highest point that tide reaches to spawn. They lay their eggs. The spawning runs can last anywhere from really a week to 3 weeks, depending. And then the eggs will hatch. The little baby smelt will kind of float down river and go back into the estuary, where they'll really eat as much as they possibly can. Smelt are carnivores. They will eat anything that they can fit in their mouths, including sometimes other smelt. And another interesting fact about smelt is they actually have teeth. So if you're out fishing for smelt or you get a smelt, whether it's in the recreational spring fishery or the ice fishery, which we'll talk about a little bit later, they do have these kind of fang-like, really sharp teeth. So don't stick your finger in a smelt mouth. That's a bad idea. But it's another thing that makes them an interesting species. And speaking of the ice fishery, smelt in the winter will hang out in the estuary under the ice. And the reason that they can hang out under the ice is because they have a protein in their blood that's similar to antifreeze. So it stops them from freezing solid when it gets super cold. So that's a really brief overview of their biology. And the other two things I want to hit on before we move on, and I'll show you a picture of some smelt eggs like we were talking about. But another thing I want to hit on is that these fish, not only are they carnivores and they eat a lot of, basically any small fish or marine worm or shrimp that they can fit in their mouth, but they are also eaten by a lot of other species, whether it's larger species of fish or birds, and again, they live in that nearshore ocean environment and in the rivers. So it's really important that they're coming back and forth and bringing those nutrients and being a good prey species to all the, osprey and eagles that we love to see this time of year. So as you can see in this picture, these are the smelt eggs. You can see they're super tiny and translucent. And this picture was from the Maine Department of Marine Resources. And you can see that they're kind of stuck to the rock like glue, which is really interesting. So they are, in fact, basically glued onto the rock. The male smelt will come upriver first, and then the females follow, and they broadcast their spawn. And so if you happen to go to a stream this time of year, you might actually see all these little dots that almost look like sand all over the rocks. And that's a good indication that you are at a stream where smelt are present. This picture is also from the Department of Marine Resources, and unfortunately all these eggs are dead. You can see there's no water present. So if the smelt broadcast their spawn at a really high tide and then the water drops, unfortunately the eggs die. But this is just to illustrate how many eggs there can potentially be in a stream, and how when they broadcast spawn, it really is the whole area of the stream that they're broadcasting in. So now you have a little bit better idea of what adult smelt look like and the eggs look like. And this is just another example of what the eggs might look like. This is Redmond's Brook, which is in Harrington. And you can see there are just so many eggs in this picture. It's actually layers and layers of smelt eggs. So an interesting fact is that smelt can have 7,000 to 75,000 eggs from one female smelt. So, potentially if you have thousands upon thousands of smelt, that's a lot of smelt eggs. And smelt, unlike a fish like salmon, don't need to come back to the exact place that they were born. They're not natal spawners. So they do have some range, so they can be flexible in that way. But when to tell if smelt are coming upstream or not to spawn, it's really water temperature is what it comes down to. So there's other species of fish that have some kind of folklore associated with their return. Like I've heard that shad come back when all the leaves on the trees are as big as mouse ears, and I haven't heard something like that about smelt. So if you've heard something like that, please do share. I love little facts like that. But that's kind of the basic overview of the biology and the life cycle of the smelt. So why are we talking about smelt? Why are we worried maybe about smelt? So numbers along the coast, you can see the picture of the range. A while ago, smelt used to be all up and down the northeastern seaboard. You can see the map, and especially now, really smelt can only be found Massachusetts up through Maine, but really Downeast Maine is really the last stronghold for smelt. So even though populations have declined, they're pretty stable in places down east, and even increasing where there have been restoration efforts. But it's really important to note that they were listed as a species of concern in 2004. So this has been a species that we've been concerned about for a while. And there are a number of reasons why smelt might be disappearing in certain areas. And really what it boils down to is loss or degradation of spawning habitat. So you can see these three pictures, and they probably don't look like they should be on the same slide or have anything to do with smelt, but it's three examples of how spawning habitat, so where they lay their eggs, and how they travel upstream to lay their eggs, can be degraded. So you can see in the picture of the culvert with the happy dog behind the culvert, you can see that culvert is not exactly working. There's no water flowing through it, which would allow fish to pass. And I will just note that this is not a smelt stream. This is just an example of a culvert that's not working. So that could be loss of spawning habitat. If there's an impediment in the river so that smelt cannot swim upstream to spawn and reproduce. And one of the interesting things about smelt is smelt will spawn wherever they can. So if they can only go up to a dam or a culvert, they can potentially spawn right in that area. But the problem with that, especially if it's below the head of tide, is that too much salt water can kill all of the eggs. So that's why we need that interconnectivity. And that's true for a lot of sea-run fish, not just smelt, but that's just the impact on smelt specifically. You can see the picture up top. Obviously, that's a sander salter truck. We all live in Maine, and we know that our winters can be a little bit crazy, and we need that salt and sand on the roads to make sure that we're safe and we can get where we're going in the winter. But that can have a negative impact during spring cleanup. So if the salt and the sand from the road is dusted off the road directly into streams, it can impact the spawning habitat, whether it's smothering the eggs themselves. So if you can imagine somebody with a shovel taking a bunch of salt and sand and throwing it into the river, it could actually smother all of those eggs that are on the bottom, stuck to rocks and other things. So another piece of that connected to that too could be, from construction, from sediment. So anything that we're inputting into the river, especially in the springtime when smelt are trying to spawn, can be a negative detriment to their populations. The picture below, the sanding truck is actually a whole bunch of smelt eggs, but you can see there's all this green stuff growing on them, and that's algae. So another way that, you and I maybe impact smelt is if we have a ton of fertilizer on our lawns, or, there's maybe a lot of farming going on near a river. Too much fertilizer can have algae grow on eggs, which again, don't allow them to properly grow and hatch. So there's all sorts of other ways that we could potentially improve smelt habitat, or we have degraded or lost spawning smelt habitat. But there's a lot of hopeful stories in Maine, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But those are the sum of why we're concerned about smelt is we need to improve the habitat that has been degraded, and we want to keep the stronghold that we have with smelt and the healthy population that we have with smelt down east, and really continue that momentum. So this is a map. You can see this is the Department of Marine Resources Smelt Survey from 1971 to 2009. And you certainly don't need to look at all the dots and look at what all the dots mean. I just show this picture to really emphasize that smelt can or have been found pretty much across the coast of Maine. So this survey is a presence-absence survey for adult smelt and eggs. And this survey could no longer continue due to loss of resources for the Department of Marine Resources. So Downeast Salmon Federation partnered up and started to do the survey. I think the first year was in 2014. So we took this survey as Downeast Salmon Federation and really just focused on Downeast because, you know, in the name, that's our focus area. So since then, we've had citizen scientists, so just regular folks from little kids to grandparents to everybody in between participate in this survey. And we were able to survey, I think at this point, it's about 175 locations with help from all sorts of people. And we were really hoping this year that we could unveil kind of the new and improved amazing Smelt survey on a new platform. But unfortunately, because of COVID-19, we weren't able to do that, but I want to give you guys a little preview. So we partnered up with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, which is the platform which is going to host this citizen science project, along with partners from the Maine Department of Marine Resources and the Nature Conservancy. So this is taking the Smelt survey that we already had existing in Downeast, Maine, and hopefully expanding it across the coast so that in perpetuity, we can be sure that we know where smelt are, where their habitat is good, where their habitat is maybe degraded. So if you're interested in this survey, you want to know more, certainly reach out to me. I wanted to make sure I mentioned it and mention the monitoring work that's going on, even though this year is a little bit of a different year. And I will note that this year, I am certainly still going out and surveying for smelt, and we have lots of help from the Department of Marine Resources, from Maine Sea Grant, from other partners, people who have helped out for years in the survey. And, you know, really this survey in Downeast, Maine, a lot of the citizen science volunteers are actually fishermen, which is really cool and really exciting. And if you're not familiar with the smelt fishery, I felt it was my duty to make sure we were all looking at the regulations just in case you want to go out and, you know, socially distance properly, but fish for smelt. And you can see that there are 3 zones in Maine. Zone 3 goes all the way to Nascaig Point in Brooklyn. Zone 2, you can see, is really the Penobscot. And then Zone 1 is Southern Maine. And I'll just say for Zone 3, you can find all of these regulations online if you just Google Sea Run Smelt Fishery Regulations. But in Zone 3, you can take 2 quarts of smelt every night from March 15th to June 30th. So a lot of the folks who helped out with the surveys and still help out with the monitoring of sea run smelt are the fishermen, because they want to know what's happening with smelt. They want to be able to fish for smelt with their kids or their grandkids and pass that heritage on. And I think that's something that's really unique about Downeast, Maine, and Maine in general, is we have these heritage fisheries, you know, whether it's recreational or commercial, where, you know, it's a piece of our heritage, it's a piece of our history. And, you know, I've gone down to Smelt Brooks myself and talked with some older folks about how they used to go out with their fathers when they were kids and all the places that they used to see smelt. And, you know, they've heard that this brook or that brook doesn't have smelt anymore, but even gathering that information is really, really helpful. And that's part of the monitoring that we do at Downeast Salmon Federation. It's not just about the fish, it's about the fish and having the fish be healthy, but also their connection to us and our connection to them, and you know, our streams and rivers and things like that. So I wanted to show you, so we've talked about the regulations, and I want to show you maybe an example of where smelt are going to spawn. So we've talked about you know, their biology, their eggs, but this is an example of a place where folks go to smelt fish down east. And I won't include the exact locations because some of these places are on private property. So it's really important, you know, to be respectful when you're fishing. But this is a really good example of nice smelt habitat where, you know, there's a healthy run. You can see that there's rocks, like the pictures of the smelt eggs all over the rocks. There's a nice rocky bottom, a good substrate for the fish to lay their eggs on. You can see it's meandering. There's nice trees and canopy cover. Smelt run upstream to spawn at night, so having that cover is important as well. And this is an example of a really great smelt stream. So you can see that there's all these smelt that are just swimming up in between those rocks. And again, you can see the grass on the bank. And obviously this picture was taken at night. It was taken by smelt fishermen who contributed to the smelt survey. And this would be considered a really great stream. You can see that the smelt are all stacked up right next to each other. And this would be, you know, a place to go see smelt, certainly. And I know myself going out and surveying for smelt at night this year, I'm still seeing folks going out and smelt fishing, which is, you know, great to continue that connection despite the circumstances right now. So again, this is another example of a smelt stream. I'm sure many of you have seen streams or rivers like this, and as long as there's unimpeded passage from the ocean up past the head of tide, smelt generally are going to be present. I've seen smelt in really large rivers. Actually, last night in the East Machias River, I saw smelt and I saw 2 seals feeding on the smelt in the East Machias River. So that's certainly a really wide river, a little bit deeper, but I've also seen smelt like in the picture before in a tiny little creek. So as long as there's healthy habitat, there's not a lot of development, there's not a lot of runoff and things like that, chances are you could potentially find smelt. And again, another picture of a smelt stream, because it's just so great to see all these little fish swimming upstream at night to spawn. And another interesting fact while we're looking at this photo is that the male smelt actually develop a sandpaper-like texture on their skin when they're going to spawn. And it's so that they can potentially stay close to females as they're spawning. And that's a really interesting piece of their life history and a thing that makes them a unique little fish. So again, another picture of the smelt fishery. And I want to make the distinction now between the spring smelt recreational fishery and the ice fishing fishery. So obviously this time of year, you know, I wanted to focus on the dip net fishery. So you can see these 2 fish were pulled up in the dip net fishery. The person who took this picture was going to fry them up. You can fry smelt up whole, just bread them, cut their heads off. But if we look, you know, a little bit in the past, when smelt were very plentiful, people used to eat them as, you know, their main meal, or they used to can them. But people also, when they were super plentiful, used to use them in their gardens as fertilizer. So there's a really long history of the recreational fishery in Maine, especially in Downeast. And it was a great protein source at the end of a long, potentially hard winter. So the recreational fishery has been going on for a really long time in the spring. And I will note that there is still a very small commercial fishery that's just down east. It's from about Millbridge to East Machias. And that commercial fishery, I believe, is the longest running, one of the longest running commercial fisheries in New England, which is an interesting fact. And back in the day, the commercial fishery used to ship boxes upon boxes to Boston of smelt to be sold at the Boston fish market. So, you know, whether it's recreational or commercial, there's just a really long history. And of course, you know, before colonization, people were fishing for smelt as well. So I want to make that important distinction as well. And then I just want to touch on the ice fishing fishery as well. This is a picture in Surrey in the 1920s. So folks still ice fish for smelt. I'm sure a lot of you, if you've heard of ice fishing for smelt, have heard of the shacks in the Kennebec and in Merrymeeting Bay, but we also have a bunch of folks who go ice fishing for smelt In Downeast, Maine too, I know in Columbia Falls, we always have 6 or 7 shacks for folks who are ice fishing. So because smelt, again, as we touched on before, are that kind of near shore fish and they like to hang out in the estuaries, it's possible to fish for them different times of the year. So again, this time of the year, obviously they're spawning, that's when we're catching them, but I wanted to acknowledge that there also is an ice fishing fishery that's part of the heritage as well. And so now I wanted to, we've talked about the biology, a little bit about the ecology, some ways that we might be losing smelt. We talked about the survey for monitoring smelt, and then I wanted to really dive into a specific story and a hopeful story too, and that's what I want to end on today. So I want to tell you guys about Smelt Brook in Sullivan. So you can see that's the basic location of the project, Smelt Brook. Obviously in the name you would think there have to be tons and tons of smelt there, but unfortunately there was this dam. So Downeast Salmon Federation bought this property, and the reason that we were even interested in this property is because surveying for smelt, so there's that monitoring piece, someone found that there were smelt eggs on this granite dam. So they swam right up there. That's all salt water. What we're looking at right now is really, it's just basically the bay. And so this cut off the smelt access upstream. So at one point in time, this was a great smelt stream, and then the granite was put in there and it was dammed up, but the smelt were still trying to come up and spawn. So Downeast Salmon Federation bought this property and worked with local landowners, and eventually all of that granite was able to be taken out, and this is what we have now. This is an aerial drone footage. You can see where the bay is in the bottom left of the photo, and then where there's all those rocks that are up on that little ledge to the right, that's where the dam used to be. So you can see this is a picture shortly after the dam was taken out. So the river's still trying to meander back. You can kind of see the channel that's being carved back in. And this was a pretty, I'll flip back to the first picture. You can see it's a pretty small dam. No one's houses were in the immediate area. There was just a small pond behind it. You can kind of see that small pond wetland area in this aerial photo. And even though it seems like a small dam, maybe an insignificant area, we actually, the first year that the dam was taken out, so in 2009, so the fall 2018, the dam was taken out. Spring 2019, there was a smelt, which is amazing. So that's an adult smelt that was caught upstream of where the dam was and released. And it's really exciting that in that short of a time, the smelt are like, oh wow, the impoundment's gone. We can swim upstream and spawn. And I can report that even this year, smelt are coming back to this location, and we certainly don't have huge numbers. It's going to take a long time before people can fish there, but it's really exciting to see that immediate response. And when we help fish like smelt, we're not just helping their species, we're helping so many other species in that that they interact with, or we're opening up habitat for other diadromous species or other species like tomcod, for instance. So these kinds of restoration projects that are done by lots of different nonprofits and different agencies and take a lot of hard work and dedication are worth it for these fish to come back. And I, again, want to emphasize the fact that we wouldn't have even known that there were smelt knocking on this dam if we hadn't been monitoring and checking to see if there are smelt. So in terms of folks getting involved in restoration efforts, citizen science and monitoring and looking for smelt or any species can be super, super important. And it might not, be the super easy to go from seeing the smelt to getting the dam removed, but it's worth all this effort to restore these amazing little fish, and to continue a piece of history and heritage in Maine. So I think I'm gonna end there, and I hope that we can have plenty of time for discussion and questions. There's certainly a lot more we can dive into. And I really look forward to talking with everybody about, the overview we just went over smelt, the smelt fishery, and smelt monitoring.
Thank you, Sarah. That was incredible, incredibly knowledgeable and enthusiastic presentation. You're an amazing storyteller as well. So thank you for all of that. We've had a couple of questions in the chat box pop up. And so maybe we can open the floor if people have questions. I guess you can put them in the chat box, and I can, Jacob or I can ask Sarah. Or you can also, I believe, raise your hand and I can try and unmute you so that you can ask Sarah yourself. Does anyone have any questions?
So Sarah, one of the questions was, do smelt and elvers compete for breeding grounds? I thought that was an awesome question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So they actually do not compete for breeding grounds, but you can find elvers where you find smelt. So last night, actually looking for smelt, I saw probably hundreds of elvers in one particular stream, which is really exciting. So they actually can use the same habitat at the same time. And when elvers are really going upstream, depending on the location, they can almost miss each other. But I've never seen a negative interaction between smelt and elvers, although I will say that I am certainly not an expert on elvers.
All righty. Right. Lander, do we have someone queued up for raising their hand?
Yes, Susan.
Yes.
Dean, I think you can talk if you are unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, you showed a map, an early map of the smelt locations from the Chesapeake all the way up, or all the way down. Is it possible, or do you know any, that climate change might have affected or be a part of that loss of smelt in the more southerly areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So smelt need pretty specific water temperatures to be able to successfully spawn. And I think that word successfully is really important because, as we said before, smelt will spawn wherever they can. So the water temperature needs to be 4 to 9 degrees Celsius. So that's climate change certainly has an impact on that. Smelt are also very sensitive to pollution, and other inputs into the water. So that's another factor. So certainly places that are more urbanized, that's a big problem. Folks have also theorized that light pollution can have an effect on smelt, because if there's a lot, if you're in a big city and there's a lot of light over even a little creek, potentially that can disrupt their spawning activity. Because they're swimming upstream at night where they're safer, there's less predators, and if there's that light pollution, it might impact if they can swim upstream or not. A small anecdote is, when you're fishing for smelt, you're not allowed to spotlight smelt in the stream, but if you do shine a light in to see where the smelt are, the smelt, generally speaking, will swim away from the light. So those are some impacts, climate change and human related impacts that can affect smelt populations.
Thank you.
I think Alexandra has a question, and I believe I unmuted you.
Yeah, thank you. Where can someone volunteer to do some of the monitoring?
So you can certainly send me an email. This year, because of COVID-19, we just decided not to put the call out to volunteers just to be really safe. But if you want to know more about the monitoring work that I do and the survey in general, I'm happy to have that conversation. If there's a bunch of folks who are interested, we can certainly set up another time to meet. And if there are just a couple of folks, please email me and reach out, because we're always looking for more people to be involved. And in spring 2021, we're going to have that big statewide survey. So it's important for folks to start thinking about that now.
Thank you.
So we had another question from the chat box. One of them was from Ann Hayden. How far do smelt travel in Maine waters?
Yeah, so in the ocean environment, smelt have not been recorded more than a mile from shore. So that's like the furthest. So they stay in the nearshore environment. I think it's important to note that in the Department of Marine Resources trawl survey, smelt has been something that they've caught along with river herring and other of those sea-run fish. So even though they like to stay near to the shore and they like to hang out in the estuary environment, again, water temperature is important for them. So if it's really hot in the summer, they're going to find that cold water to be able to, be comfortable and live successfully. So you certainly can find smelt in the ocean environment, but certainly not in the deep ocean environment.
And then Sarah, there was a prompt from Karen for you to repeat your email address if you wouldn't mind, so that people could reach out to you. Would you, just before we forget?
Absolutely. So it's Sarah, SARAH, at mainsalmonrivers.org, and I'm going to put it in the chat as well so everybody can see it.
Great. Lander, do you have another queued audio question?
Yes, it looks like we have a question from Natalie.
Okay.
Let me see if I can, I'm having trouble unmuting. Natalie, are you? Oh, sorry, I brought up your.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
I just wanted to know also about volunteering. She answered the question by email, responding to her by email.
You're interested in Sarah's email?
Yes. Yes. She answered it, but I was wondering about volunteering.
Unfortunately, it's a little bit fuzzy. Sarah, did you catch that?
Yeah, so I think you said that you were interested in volunteering.
Yeah.
So for this year, certainly, if we have enough folks, I'm happy to do a short training. We do require that for the smelt survey to be involved unless you're an expert. So a biologist or, something like that. We do ask that people train for the survey first. So certainly from this conversation and this presentation, if there's enough folks who are interested, the smelt right now are kind of in their peak of the run in Hancock County. So for instance, in places like Sullivan and Ellsworth, I know that the run is really kind of hitting its peak right now. So it's a little bit late. In Cobscook Bay, for instance, which is where I spend a lot of my time, I live in Cutler, the run is really just starting for spawning smelt. So certainly if you'd like to go out and look, I know from our data from previous years, folks went out and saw fish in Blue Hill in the last week in May. So it's certainly possible, but I just want to make sure everybody's aware that it is the, going towards the end of the run in your area.
Okay, thank you.
Sarah, there was a question from Andrew Masters. How has climate change affected smelt?
Yeah, so we touched on that a little bit before. And I think in terms of climate change really impacting smelt, it's down to water temperature. And I'm sure a lot of you folks know that the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies of water in the world. And so that's going to impact all sea-run species. And, you know, again, in Downeast, we're kind of because of where we are and how north we are, we tend to be the last in Maine to feel those effects. But it's certainly something to be mindful of. And I think it's a really good piece of context to really be motivated about restoration efforts and everybody getting involved in terms of any sea run monitoring, whether it's river herring or smelt. So I think, you know, as the Gulf of Maine warms, that the timing of the smelt run is going to be different. So making sure that we know where we are today and where we're going to be in 10 years in terms of the start date and the end date of smelt spawning is important information to capture. And that's how we're really going to be able to dig down and tell how climate change is affecting smelt. And, you know, as I mentioned, the DMR survey the presence absence survey went until 2009. So 2009 until, you know, 2021, we haven't had a concentrated, really, you know, a lot of effort in a statewide presence absence survey for smelt during spawning. So having that information is really, really critical in the face of climate change.
Thanks, Sarah. Lander, do we have anybody queued up for an audio question, or?
Let's see. I'm not seeing any hands raised, but I do see a couple of questions in the chat box. Do you want to read them off, Jacob?
Sure. I think and you know what, feel free to repeat yourselves, y'all, if we're missing you or something. But let's see. We had a question. Is the survey being done in New Hampshire as well as Maine, or a similar one?
I'm not quite sure. I know that I think it was in 2011, 2012, Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts got together to produce a report on kind of how smelt are doing and work together on some research efforts. So there's a FICNet survey that happened, I believe it was from Massachusetts all the way up to Maine in 2012, 13-ish, but I'm not entirely sure what the status of the smelt population is in New Hampshire and what their efforts look like. You know, hopefully once we get the Maine survey up and running, that can have some more conversation happening between the, you know, other states that have some small smelt populations. And I will note too that smelt are also, you know, obviously in Canada as well. So we can't forget that part of their population too.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. We have another question in the chat box. Is there a place that we can go on the peninsula or Deer Isle to see a smelt run? And then she said, sorry if you already addressed this.
Yeah, so actually something that I was just talking about to colleagues not too long ago, there are a couple of locations that have been surveyed in the past, not with Downeast Salmon Federation survey. So I would actually be interested to know where some of the active smelt runs might be. I'm sure that there are a couple streams that have smelt. I used to live in Deer Isle and had heard of a couple of different places, but I don't have it off the top of my head to share with everyone. And I'm certainly happy if you reach out via email, I can tell you where the places that have been surveyed in the past were. And, you know, if there's anyone else who has more information, you know, please share.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Another question is, how did inland species of smelt develop differently than the diadromous smelts?
Yeah, so I will say right off the bat, I am absolutely not an expert on this, but I can share what I know. So the inland smelt, those are the landlocked smelt, so they're exactly the same species. There's, in terms of their genetics, there's not a difference. So from my understanding, the inland landlocked smelt tend to be a bit smaller than the sea run smelt. And I know that depending on the location with sea-run species, a number of sea-run species actually can become landlocked. And depending on where they're landlocked, it can be a positive or a negative. In Maine, we have landlocked smelt. Those have different regulations than the regulations I shared for the sea-run recreational fishery. So those are IF&W, Inland Fish and Wildlife regulations, which I don't know very much about, but I know in Maine we have a fishery for landlocked smelt as well. But in terms of how they've developed differently, I don't have much more information than that, unfortunately.
Awesome, Sarah. Thank you. I don't know if we have any other, Linda, are there any other queued questions that I'm missing?
Don't think so, but if we are missing something, please send it in again or raise your hand if you have another question for Sarah. We still have a few minutes. Got them all. Well, if that is all the questions that we have for Sarah tonight, thank you so, oh, we got another question or something, let's see.
It's from a James Pedersen. Greetings from Charlotte, North Carolina. What can I do as a summer resident in Maine to help other than monitoring? Because that's kind of not an option right now considering the current events. So is there anything that people can do from home or remotely? Or
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mentioned before, something like putting fertilizer on your lawn or not having a good buffer between, your lawn and a body of water, whether that's a stream, a pond, a river. So by having a buffer, I mean shrubs or trees, just so there's not that runoff right into the water. So something like household pollution, that's something we all can participate on. And it's not just going to help smelt, it's going to help bugs, and it's going to help birds and all other kinds of species. So I think being aware of those kinds of small things, and then also get to know your local stream wherever you're a summer resident in Maine. If you have, some streams nearby, get to know them. Go walk down and see what they're like, paddle if you can, or swim. I think, one of the things that we can all do is be stewards of our local environment and our local rivers. And if we have some kind of awareness of what's going on year to year, we can notice when things are maybe awry, or maybe we should talk to our local land trust and say, hey guys, I noticed this, or I went on this property, or, even your local nonprofit, your town office. If we can be aware of our surroundings, we can help fish like smelt. And I know that's not super specific to smelt themselves, but I think in general, those kinds of practices and being in Maine and having the access to the outdoors like we do in Maine, I think that's a really key piece. And some of the restoration projects that Downeast Salmon Federation have been involved in have been people saying, hey, I was four-wheeling on this trail and I noticed this culvert was really badly damaged. And sometimes that can be a quick fix. Sometimes it's a years-long project, but people going out and observing their surroundings is just so critical to this kind of restoration and keeping fish healthy.
Thank you, Sarah. We have another question in the chat box, and then somebody raised their hand. So the question in the chat box is, could you talk a little bit about the relationship between alewives and smelt?
Yeah, so alewives and smelt really are two ships passing in the night. So alewives and smelt do run at similar times, and by run I mean they swim upstream to spawn. So alewives obviously swim further upstream to lakes and ponds than smelt do. But right now, I know I'll use the Pennamequon and Pembroke as an example. At night, we're seeing smelt running upstream, and then during the day, we're seeing river herring or alewives swimming upstream. So typically, it's the alewives during the day, the smelt at night. but they definitely do share those waterways. And both of those types of fish are fish that school. So they swim together in large numbers for protection. So in that way, they're somewhat similar, although alewives are certainly much bigger than smelt are. So in terms of a relationship, they're both prey species. That's their ecological role. So they get to feed all of the birds and mammals and other fish. And whether that's in the ocean environment, the estuary environment, or the river environment. So they certainly don't have any negative interactions that I'm aware of, but they do spawn at similar times, and typically, depending on the stream, but typically smelt will start running upstream to spawn earlier than smelt do, or than alewives do, excuse me.
Great, Sarah. We just had another chat box question pop up, and do they eat the same food? I think that's referring to alewives and smelt.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, smelt will eat anything they can fit in their mouths. So whether that's juvenile fish or other types of animals. For alewives, they're more specific with what they eat. So they like to eat zooplankton, which could be copepods, amphipods, juvenile shrimp, juvenile crabs. So they have similar diets, but they're not the same. And I would say that smelt are more generalized eaters. And the smelt also, remember, have teeth, and whereas alewives do not have teeth. So they can kind of chew up some bigger, meatier type items like fish, especially like baby fish. So, but again, smelt are smaller than alewives. So, you know, they can't eat anything that's too big, but they have similar but different diets. And of course, alewives too, you know, when they're in lakes and ponds, they eat, you know, totally different forage species and different things than smelt could have access to.
So, Sarah, we got a question in the Q&A box, which is there a recent map of smelt rivers in Maine?
Yeah, so there are in a couple of different locations. So certainly one of the places you can go, DSF used to do our smelt survey on ANIC data, which I'm sure many of you might be familiar with. It was developed by MDI Biological Laboratories, and it's a great starter place if you have a citizen science survey. So we've since moved to the Gulf of Maine Research Institute's site, but that's where we started. So you can look back at our old data on there. Certainly if folks, again, reach out to me via email and I can send you all this stuff. But also, there's a map, it's the mainstream habitat viewer that some of you may be familiar with. You can just Google that. And they do have a map that shows current and historical spawning locations. It's not the most up to date, but that's the point of doing this survey work and having this citizen science project, is we want that to be super up to date. And I certainly have my own maps for Downeast Maine. So if you're looking for a particular place, I'm happy to share locations with you. And as always, I can only share the public locations, so not in someone's backyard to protect their privacy. But yeah, I'm happy to answer those questions if you reach out via email.
Great, Sarah. Thank you. We had a question from Ryan Hughes. Has dam removal on the Penobscot and Kennebec rivers had a large impact on the island range of smelt migration?
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely, no doubt. So smelt can go to the head of tide and above the head of tide. So on the Penobscot and the Kennebec, removing those dams, the change has been unbelievable, not for smelt, just for smelt, but for all sea-run species. And I think, you know, when we're doing this survey more statewide rather than just down east, you know, the Penobscot is such a critical place to be looking. On the Kennebec, I know that the Department of Marine Resources does creel surveys, so that's wintertime surveys of ice fishing. So they have more of a handle on at least that wintertime smelt population. So they've been doing those surveys for quite some time. But again, doing this statewide survey and having this information, then we can compare those 2009 and 2021 numbers and really see what the difference is. But any impediment or dam that's taken out that allows, head of tide to migrate where it's supposed to be, or that allows for there to be that passage, the smelt will come, the alewives will come, different species of sea run fish. They're not the most picky.
Awesome. Lander, I think we're current on our questions.
I think we are too. Any last minute questions? We have 3 minutes left until 5. Sarah, we're getting a lot of wonderful comments in the chat box, which I'm not sure if you can see, but of people thanking you for the presentation and for your wonderful energy and knowledge. And we definitely feel the same way.
Yeah, I love fish and I love my job, so I hope it shows.
Definitely shown through. Thank you so much. I guess if people have further questions, they could reach out to your email. And
I will just note, if you do reach out to my email, I will have an email bounce back that says I'm in the field right now, but I will be checking my email and I will get back to everyone as soon as I can. As a field biologist this time of year, I'm outside almost all the time, which is awesome, but doesn't leave me a whole lot of time to read through all of my emails.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And then, Lander, did you want to plug for next week?
Oh yeah, so for those of you who are still on this webinar, our upcoming webinar next Thursday is also about fish, because this is the season, and it's called Brooks to Bays and Back, and it's with Chris DeVore from the Craig Brook Fish Hatchery, Siona Ulbrich from Maine Coast Heritage Trust, and Alex Dranga, who is a biologist and outdoor educator. And you can find registration on the Blue Heritage Trust website as well as Island Heritage Trust website.
And Sarah, thank you again so much for your time and your knowledge. It was awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Everyone have a good night.